What would happen if you accidentally discovered someone's heart hidden among the dusty pages of an old diary? What if, within that notebook, lay living proof that an entire existence was ignored by the world, yet still left traces of light wherever it passed? This isn't just another sad story left in the dust. It's a wake-up call, a call to conscience, an emotional punch to those who believe that silence is synonymous with absence. In the midst of some random renovation in an abandoned house in the middle of the United States, a forgotten diary surfaced to prove that memories don't die. They just wait for the right moment to be reborn. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for you. While many live in pursuit of recognition, success, and likes, this story reveals a brutal and counterintuitive truth. It's possible to change the world without being seen. A soul who never had a stage, never received applause, but who touched countless lives with her kindness, resilience, and silent love. A human being who was left behind, but who, in secret, planted seeds of empathy, forgiveness, and humanity. By watching this narrative, you will not only discover the mystery of a life erased, you will be challenged to examine your own existence. What marks are you leaving on the world? What will be remembered of you when time decides to erase your name? This video is not just a tribute. It is an emotional revolution. A chance to delve into the depths of the invisible and emerge transformed. Because every word written by this forgotten soul can be the mirror you needed to recognize yourself. Prepare yourself for a journey that blends emotion, wisdom, emotion, and inspiration. It won't be easy, but it will be impossible to emerge unscathed. You will laugh, you will cry, and above all, you will remember who you are. There was something magical or perhaps mystical about that autumn afternoon, when the dry sound of a loose floorboard revealed a secret buried under decades of oblivion. An old wooden house, far from the city and surrounded by trees that seemed like guardians of time, had been purchased for renovation. And it was there, amid the creaking of the floorboards and the musty smell, that one of the workers found something unusual. A worn leather notebook, covered in a thin layer of dust, lying like a whisper among the rubble. It was a diary. The pages, yellowed and fragile, hid within them more than words. They held life, dreams, pain, and silences that spanned generations. And in that instant, a strange feeling took hold of whoever held it. Fear, curiosity, respect, but above all, a profound sense that this object should not have been forgotten. It was as if the house itself asked, in its ancient language, that its past be unearthed with affection and dignity. Opening the first page, almost afraid of disturbing what seemed sacred, the reader, a young restorer named Michael, came across a name that had been virtually erased. The handwriting, firm and elegant, revealed something more intimate than any official document. With each line, a breath of life emerged, as if the writer's soul were resurrected within the letters. Michael, who until then had seen his work merely as a way to earn a living, was overcome by a restlessness that mixed empathy with overwhelming curiosity. Who was this person? Why was his story buried? And even more, why had he, among so many, been chosen to find it? Life, which had previously followed its monotonous course, now pulsed with the freshness of an unexpected adventure. The diary was not just a historical find, it was an invitation to humanity, a gateway to delve into the emotional abyss of someone who, despite being forgotten, cried out to be remembered with respect and compassion. Each paragraph seemed to give voice to a silenced pain. The pages, despite their wear, brimmed with sincerity, and there was an almost invisible force there, as if the universe itself were conspiring so that this story would finally find attentive ears. It was impossible to ignore the wisdom hidden between the lines, the love suffocated between the lines, and the timid hope that insisted on blossoming, even between pages stained with time. Michael, driven by a sense of responsibility and a compassion he didn't even know he possessed, decided to immerse himself in reading with the reverence of someone visiting a forgotten tomb. From that day on, every break from work was filled with the immersion in other people's emotions that, so human, seemed his own. And so, without realizing it, he began a journey of reconciliation not only with the other person's past, but with the very gaps in his own soul. For some stories choose U.S., and this was one of those rare stories that, when read, also rewrites us from within. The first pages of the diary exuded a painful nostalgia, as if each written word were an attempt to heal wounds that never fully healed. The young author, whose name still remained undecipherable, described his days in a small town with a frankness that ached. He spoke of silent mornings, where the birdsong couldn't drown out the sound of loneliness. The hallways of the house, though wide, seemed too narrow for his aching heart. His parents, though alive, were absent in spirit always. Distant, busy, cold. There was an unspoken plea for affection, a stifled desire to belong, to be seen with respect and treated with kindness. Each line revealed the courage of a young man to name what many refuse to admit, the emptiness that accompanies us even when the sun shines outside. And it was in this silence that understanding was necessary, for not all loneliness arises from physical absence. Often, it stems from a lack of emotional connection. As Michael continued reading, his empathy for this stranger intensified. It was impossible not to be moved by the raw sincerity of the words. The young author spoke of his constant attempt to fit in, of the insecurity that haunted him even in moments of joy, and of the fear of being rejected for who he truly was. There was precocious wisdom in those lines, a rare sensitivity that, unfortunately, was perceived by others as weakness. The diary mentions small gestures of kindness he received from strangers, a teacher who offered him a book of poetry, a man at the grocery store who always gave him an apple without charging, and how these moments awakened a sense of hope in him. Small acts of altruism that, however brief, left marks of humanity on his bruised chest. How powerful the impact of kindness is when one is on the verge of giving up. In these accounts, Michael saw reflected the power of resilience, of perseverance. Hidden in the smallest gestures of everyday life, the diary spared no words when describing the days when everything seemed to fall apart. The lack of communication with his parents, the weight of other people's expectations, and the constant comparison with more adjusted siblings or peers made him feel like a walking mistake. Still, there was something admirable in the way he kept writing, as if the diary were his only confidant, his only safe place. And perhaps, without realizing it, he was leaving a legacy of courage there. Michael reflected on how many people feel this way and can't find a space where they can be honest without judgment. He thought about how many silent souls we pass every day, wearing fake smiles when all they need is a welcoming look. The story told there revealed the emotional intelligence of someone who, despite his youth, understood the value of listening, of friendship, of empathy. It was as if the diary, in its stillness, cried out for reconciliation with a world that had forgotten how to be human. And something in the air whispered that the following pages would hold even more unexplored truths. It was in the middle pages of the diary that the tone changed. The young man, previously shrouded in the mist of loneliness, began to write with a different radiance. A new figure emerged, an engaging presence that defied the standards of the time and ignited within him a rare, deep and authentic flame. There were no names, only pronouns and feelings. The words began to flow as if his heart dictated each line. He recounted secret encounters under the silvery moonlight, silent walks among trees, and the warmth of clasped hands hidden under books. In the school library, it was a forbidden love, not because of the feeling itself, but because of the world around him, cruel in the way it judged what it didn't understand. Even amidst the fear, there was a kind of courage that only those who truly love know. A love that carried with it the delicacy of affection and the strength of resistance. Michael, reading these accounts, felt something tighten in his chest. this wasn't just an old romance. It was a reminder of how much compassion, respect, and acceptance the world still lacks. The most intense passages of this love were filled with honesty. The author recounted the challenges he faced, the disapproving looks, the veiled threats, the harsh words spoken by his own family. Yet, what stood out was the tenderness. He described how that love made him feel seen, welcomed, and whole. There was beauty in the simplicity of their secret routines, like writing poetry together, drawing pictures of each other, or even sharing silence, knowing that there was understanding there. Michael reflected on how many love stories are silenced before they even blossom. The diary became a tribute to all the souls who, out of fear or imposition, were unable to live fully embodied what they felt. It was as if the author, decades earlier, had already understood the importance of fighting for something greater than oneself. Love, when lived with integrity, becomes an act of resistance. And in that relationship, though shrouded in shadows, there existed the powerful light of authenticity, trust, and hope that insists on blossoming even in arid terrain. What touched Michael most was realizing that love, even interrupted by external pressures, never ceased to live on in the written words. There was no resentment in memories, only longing and gratitude. This made him reflect on how true affections, when nurtured with sincerity, never disappear completely. They remain like echoes within us, shaping who we are. The diary revealed that, even after the forced separation, the author continued to write to the other, as if his words could transcend distance and time. This was more than romanticism. It was proof that deep emotional bonds transcend physical barriers. The story made it clear that, no matter how much society tries to erase them, genuine feelings endure. Michael began to imagine how many stories like that lay hidden, waiting only for a willing gaze to welcome them, to listen with empathy. And as he turned the page, he sensed there were more mysteries hidden, perhaps even deeper, ready to be revealed with humility and attention. The following pages of the diary revealed a new tone, denser, quieter, almost as if each word had been wrenched out with pain. It was like walking through a minefield of unresolved memories, where each sentence carried with it an emotional burden, difficult to bear. The author, still young at the time of writing, began to write about his childhood with a mixture of delicacy and bitterness. He didn't accuse, he didn't shout, simply narrating with unusual maturity the signs of emotional abandonment that permeated his story. His father was portrayed as a constant absence, remembered more by the sound of the door slamming as he left than by any gesture of affection. His mother, though physically present, seemed emotionally distant, enveloped in her own pain and silence. The boy grew up learning not to expect, not to ask, not to feel too much. Michael, reading each passage, felt a lump in his throat. That was a faithful portrait of many childhoods, marked by a loneliness that, though invisible to others, left deep scars on the soul. In one of the most moving pages, the author described a seemingly banal but profoundly revealing episode. A rainy day when locked in his room, he drew for hours, hoping someone would notice his sadness. No one came. The silence lasted until nightfall. That moment, lost in the chronology of life, was immortalized in his memory as the day he realized his feelings had no place there. It was in this context that he developed his sensitivity and emotional intelligence, as he learned to observe the world in silence, to capture subtleties, to decipher emotions that were not always expressed. Michael understood that this kind of pain, though silent, was one of the most difficult to heal. He thought of how many adults carry open wounds from childhood, fighting internal battles with insecurity, fear, and lack of trust. Those pages weren't just a vent, but also an emotional map of how early trauma shapes our choices, our way of loving, and even our capacity to forgive. As he progressed, Michael realized that the author didn't write simply to record memories. He wrote to understand himself. There was a particularly moving moment when he mentioned his grandfather's gaze, which, even in silence, seemed to know everything. A gaze that said, "I know, and I'm sorry I can't do anything." These small sparks of connection saved the author from a complete plunge into abandonment. A teacher who secretly praised him, a neighbor who baked chocolate bread just for him, a mailman who smiled sincerely as he delivered mail. These were subtle gestures, but they gave him a sense of value. The generosity of these encounters helped keep his faith in humanity alive. Michael reflected on the power of kindness, on how a simple gesture can become an emotional anchor for someone about to fall. And between the lines of the diary, there emerged the feeling that there was even more hidden, more unspoken truths, more layers of a story that needed to be revealed with courage and sensitivity. It was between two pages glued together by time that Michael found something unexpected, a small bundle of letters, carefully folded and tied with frayed string. The handwriting was familiar, firm, with traces of restrained emotion. Each letter had a different addressee, but none had been sent. There was one for his mother, another for his lost love, others written to himself, as if they were diaries. Within the diary itself, the content of these letters was brutally honest. They were confessions that had never found a hearing, words that overflowed from a heart that held the hope of one day being understood. The letter to his mother, for example, was a silent plea for affection, a cry for recognition, written with the tenderness of someone who still believes that a gesture of affection can repair years of silence. Michael felt a chill reading it. It was like witnessing the moment a soul strips away all protection and reveals its most intimate vulnerability. That was where the true power of sincerity resided, in the courage to show oneself without masks. Letter to the Lost Love was a poem disguised as a farewell. The author spoke of absence with a lyricism that touched deeply. There was no pressure, nor anger, only longing, gratitude, and a love that refused to be corrupted by time. He wrote about the moments lived with a precision that made everything seem recent. He described the smell of each other's hair, the sound of muffled laughter during hidden afternoons, the tremor in their hands as they said goodbye for the last time. It was impossible not to feel moved by that emotional surrender. Michael, deeply moved, reflected on the things we failed to say. How many letters we ourselves keep in our minds and hearts, waiting for a right moment that never arrives. How many times we remain silent out of fear, insecurity, or pride. The unsent letters then became the portrait of an entire life lived intensely, but hindered by invisible barriers. Each one carried within it a plea for reconciliation, a breath of hope, a search for redemption. Even more impactful was the series of letters written to himself. They were records of self-reflection, of sincere attempts to understand what was going on inside his own soul. There were confessions about sleepless nights, about the fear of going crazy, about the constant internal battle between giving up and keeping trying. But there were also glimpses of self-esteem, passages in which he congratulated himself on small victories, like getting out of bed or looking someone in the eye. It was a rare, profound, and revealing exercise in emotional intelligence. Michael realized a powerful lesson there. Writing to oneself can be an act of courage and healing. He thought about how many people could benefit from writing their own unsent letters as a path to overcoming. One could write to forgive one's parents, to free an unlived love, or even to thank one's inner child for having resisted. The diary, with these letters, made it clear that words have the power to reorganize internal chaos, and that, even unread, they can save. Michael had already read many pages marked by loneliness, pain, and silent memories, but it was with an unexpected entry that everything changed. The tone of the words gained color. The diary's author, until then introspective and melancholic, began to write with enthusiasm, as if rediscovering a forgotten piece of his soul. He mentioned the arrival of someone new in his life, a figure who appeared at first as a whisper, but soon became a central presence. Someone who saw beyond the shell, who read his drawings with interest, who listened to his stories without interrupting. This person, whose name had also been carefully omitted, seemed to have been the spark that rekindled the flame of self-esteem in him. The author wrote with hope, courage, and even humor. He talked about painting pictures, writing a book, traveling to places with strange names. For the first time, the diary overflowed with confidence, resilience, and initiative. It was like seeing a soul, previously bent by the weight of life, slowly but surely rising. In the following pages, the author described his new routine: waking up earlier, drinking coffee while looking out the window, laughing alone at things that would previously have made him cry. He spoke of an imaginary train journey he planned to take through the countryside, collecting stories from strangers. He also mentioned the art classes he began attending, encouraged by this new friend, and how they made him feel alive. Art, at that moment, became not just an escape, but a bridge between his inner world and the world around him. He described the joy of seeing his paintings take shape, color, and movement. He said that painting was like talking to God in silence. Michael read all of this with a warm heart, enchanted by the strength of overcoming that blossomed there. It was living proof that often, all it takes is one person to believe in us for an entire universe to begin to transform. The author's perseverance in rebuilding himself was touching, an example of how collaboration and affection can be powerful tools of healing. However, not everything was certain. Along with this phase of rebirth, fears also emerged. The author wrote about the fear of not being good enough, the worry of dreaming too big, the cruel doubt about whether it would all last. Michael, experienced in reading other people's feelings, knew this was part of the process. After all, there is no transformation without insecurity. Even hope needs courage to stay alive. The diary was now a fertile field where the joy of newness and old ghosts coexisted. But the most striking thing was how the author was willing to move forward, even in fear. He didn't erase the pain of the past, but used it as fuel. Michael closed the diary for a moment, looked up at the ceiling of his old house, and thought to himself, "This is what the world needs, stories like this. Stories that show us that no matter how much a soul has been forgotten, it can blossom again." And when he returned to reading, he knew the next page would hold an even more profound twist. Michael reached the end of the diary with the anxiety of someone awaiting a great revelation. He turned the last page with his heart racing, ready to find the conclusion to this moving journey. But what he found was an abrupt silence. The last entry was dated but unfinished. The sentence ended mid-thought, as if the author had been interrupted by something urgent or perhaps definitive. There was no farewell, no final reflection, not even a signature. Just a long stroke, as if the pen had slipped from his hand and never returned to the paper. Michael stood still for a few seconds, as if the emptiness of the page had also reached him. This wasn't just a diary without an ending. It was an echo of a life interrupted, an existence left on hold. It was like opening a book and discovering that the last chapter had been ripped out. The lack of closure hurt more than any written word. It screamed for justice, for an answer, for understanding. It was the kind of silence that demands attention. Michael reread the last pages, trying to find clues. Something that hinted at what had happened to the author. A change in mood, a new name, a place mentioned. But nothing seemed to indicate a tragic outcome or a planned escape. On the contrary, there was excitement in the most recent lines, plans for the future, lists of things he wanted to do. The lack of an ending made everything seem even more unfair. It was as if time had swallowed a soul in full bloom. Michael wondered how many similar stories had been lost like this, through carelessness, silence, abandonment. How many people vanish from the world without a trace, taking with them a wealth of experiences, dreams, and feelings. The diary now became a kind of emotional tomb. There was no headstone, no flowers, but there were memories. and that was enough to provoke a painful unease. The author's life couldn't have simply evaporated. He deserved to be remembered, celebrated, respected. The story couldn't end like this, and perhaps that was precisely the diary's strongest call. The absence of an ending became an invitation to continue the search, to prevent this life from being swallowed by the dust of time. Michael understood that this gap was not the end, but the beginning of a new stage. A new mystery needed to be unraveled. Who was this person? Where are they? Has anyone looked for them? Are there records, photos, witnesses? Curiosity turned into a mission, and empathy into a sense of responsibility. It was impossible to turn one's back on it. The absence of an ending became, paradoxically, the starting point for something greater. Michael knew that to honor the memory of that unknown person, he would need to go beyond the pages. He would need to look into the eyes of the real world, search archives, talk to strangers, and face the fear of finding nothing. The silence of that last page was powerful. It didn't end the story. It simply signaled that sometimes it's up to us to write the endings that time has tried to erase. Determined not to let that story end in silence, Michael began a veritable pilgrimage for answers. With the diary in hand and a heart full of restlessness, he began visiting local registry offices, municipal archives, and public libraries. With each door he knocked, he brought not only a reader's curiosity, but also a silent commitment to honoring a forgotten life. The process was slow and at times frustrating. Many records were damaged, others had been discarded, and the people he spoke to rarely remembered old names. However, perseverance combined with hope, and little by little, fragments began to emerge. A partially erased name in the diary matched a surname recorded in a school report from the 1970s. A yellowed photograph, forgotten in a school archive, showed a shy-looking boy with a notebook in his hand. The image was silent, but it said everything. Michael felt as if he were pulling on an invisible thread, untying knots that time had tried to tighten. During a visit to an old hospital in the city, one of the older nurses mentioned a forgotten patient, a young man who had been admitted for an emotional breakdown and had subsequently disappeared from the records. There was little information, just a file with his first name and a note. I painted, I wrote, I had silent crises. It was small, but it was enough to confirm that the diary's author had not simply disappeared. He had been swallowed up by a system that often fails to welcome, understand, and care for him. The discovery provoked a whirlwind of emotions in Michael. There was indignation, sadness, but also an even greater sense of responsibility. That young man, with all his generosity, sensitivity, and talent, had been silenced not only by his family, but by a society unprepared to deal with emotional pain. The story ceased to be merely private and became collective. It was a mirror of the reality of many who, due to a lack of acceptance and emotional intelligence, are swallowed up by oblivion, moved by a mixture of compassion, courage, and a sense of justice. Michael began to document everything. He created maps, transcribed letters, organized dates, and recorded testimonies. He spoke with former residents, retired teachers, and neighbors forgotten by time. A man remembered hearing the author's music on the piano. A woman recalled a drawing he had given her during a difficult time. Every detail stitched the story back together, like a tapestry mended with affection and truth. The search for answers became, in practice, an exercise in humanity. It was a living lesson in empathy, collaboration, and the power of kindness. Michael knew he couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that life would receive the recognition and dignity it always deserved. And as he gathered the last pieces, he understood that sometimes the best way to honor someone is to ensure their story is never forgotten. The diary ceased to be an antique object and became a living symbol of perseverance and reconnection. As Michael deepened his search, something extraordinary began to happen. Stories that seemed dormant began to emerge. Ordinary people, who barely remembered the missing young man's name, began to share memories they had held onto, even without knowing why. An elderly former teacher was moved to tears when she remembered. A student who always submitted essays illustrated with delicate, profound drawings. She still kept one of these sheets, tucked between the pages of a philosophy book. A neighbor told of mornings when she would hear a piano playing softly from next door, never knowing who the musician was. The caregiver of a bedridden woman recalled receiving a paper flower on a difficult day, delivered by a quiet boy drawing in the backyard. Small gestures, quick smiles, simple gifts. Marks that, even without fanfare, had left deep traces. It was impossible not to be moved. It was impossible not to recognize the strength of a life that, though invisible to the world, had touched souls with sincerity and affection. Michael came to understand that, even when we are not celebrated in life, our actions have power. The diary writer, unknowingly, had inspired, calmed, and comforted so many people around him. His compassion manifested itself in the smallest gestures. His wisdom flowed in words never spoken aloud. The teacher, for example, said that the essay gave her the strength to continue teaching amidst a personal crisis. The neighbor said the sound of the piano saved his lonely Sundays after his wife's death. The paper flower has been kept by the caretaker to this day as a talisman against bad days. The impact of the author's presence was subtle, yet enormous. It revealed a universal truth. We don't always see the full extent of our actions, but they reverberate powerfully in the world. It was a pure reflection of altruism, generosity, and the power of kindness. The true legacy lies not in monuments or medals, but in the memories we plant without realizing it. Michael realized that the mission he had begun by chance now had a much greater purpose. It wasn't just about telling the story of someone who had been forgotten. It was about showing the world that every life matters, that every human being carries within them a spark of light, even when living in the shadows. The diary writer's journey was a lesson in humility, humanity, and resilience. It was confirmation that affection takes root, even when a thank you isn't heard. It was the inspiration so many, like that young man, still live in silence, feeling invisible, needed. Michael knew he was onto something powerful. And by bringing together all these parallel stories, he envisioned a gesture that could, in fact, immortalize this journey. A gesture that would honor not only the diary writer, but all who silently continue to try to find meaning in a world that isn't always ready to listen. With the diary complete, the letters organized, and the stories gathered, Michael felt he needed to do something more. That story couldn't just go back into a drawer or become another archived document. It needed to be shared. So he decided to transform the diary into a memorial book. A small, carefully printed volume containing the most memorable pages, the unsent letters, the original illustrations, and the memories of those touched by that invisible young man. The project gained spontaneous support from residents, artists, teachers, and even the local government. It was as if the city, in recognizing that story, also reconnected with its own essence. The book was distributed free of charge in schools, cultural centers, and libraries. There was something symbolic in that gesture. It was life returning to pulse in words. It was proof that empathy can reverse oblivion, and that compassion can rewrite someone's destiny, even if belatedly. The diary of a forgotten soul now had a voice, a body, and a purpose. The memorial's unveiling was marked by a simple yet deeply moving ceremony. People who had never spoken before came forward to share their stories. An elderly man revealed that he had also written diaries in his youth, but burned them for fear of being judged. A teenager confessed that she had considered giving up on life until she read a passage from the diary and felt understood. Families began rummaging through old trunks in search of letters, photos, and mementos. The city, once dormant in its routine, found itself touched by a collective movement of reconnection. The past, once swept away by time, now resurfaced with force, nourishing the present with meaning. Michael watched, with teary eyes, the multiplication of what had begun with a simple reading. It was like witnessing the power of humanity in action, a movement of forgiveness, reconciliation, and collective generosity. It made it clear that no story is too small when told truthfully. The book's impact was not limited to the city. Videos began to circulate, posts were shared, and soon the story crossed borders. The diary, once hidden under forgotten boards, became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of resilient love. People from different places sent messages saying how touched they were, how reading it awakened memories, how they saw themselves reflected in that young man. The impact multiplied with unexpected force. Michael, in his humility, understood that the merit was not his alone. It belonged to that forgotten soul, who with sincerity and courage left their mark for the world to follow. His memory was now reborn in every reader, in every tear, in every gesture of kindness inspired by his words. And deep down, it wasn't just the story of one man. It was the story of all of us. Because every human being, deep down, desires the same thing: to be remembered with love. And now, after walking through the story of silence, beauty, pain, and hope, tell me honestly, how many forgotten souls have you ignored without realizing it? How many stories live around you, waiting only for a gesture of attention, a genuine listening ear, a kind word? Perhaps you yourself carry an invisible diary within your chest, hoping someone will read it with an open heart. Or perhaps you are the one who, like Michael, has the chance to give voice to what has been silenced by time. The question is, what will you do with this chance? This diary isn't just about someone who disappeared. It's about all of us. About our hidden fears, our childhood wounds, our unsent letters. It's about that love that wasn't lived, that conversation left half finished, that talent you buried out of insecurity. It's time to rewrite your story with empathy, courage, love, and wisdom. It's time to remember that you too leave marks, even when no one is looking. That your choices can be beacons of hope for someone, even when you don't realize it. And that true transformation begins when we have the humility to look within and the compassion to look without. So, I ask you, what will your next page be? Will you continue living as if you weren't the protagonist of your own story? Or will you take the initiative to reconnect with your truth, reclaim your memories, and perhaps help others do the same? Leave your comment below. Share what touched you most. And if you feel this story needs to reach others, spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and join us on this journey of rediscovery, sensitivity, and inspiration. Because here, every memory has value. Every life deserves to be celebrated, including yours.